Hello everybody, welcome to Church History Insights and Questions. My name is David Eaton. This is episode 11 and it's about violence in the church. Well, it's both sides really, perpetrated against the church, but also perpetrated in the church or from the church. So some of this information is very difficult to hear, and if you're unfamiliar with some of the history, particularly the Mountain Meadows Massacre, when we get to that, it's very upsetting and difficult to hear. So a bit of a health warning. This could be a bit of a triggering episode for anybody who's particularly unfamiliar with this material. Let's get into it. Adversaries in Ohio, Missouri, and Illinois resented the saints' differing religious beliefs and social and economic practices. They also felt threatened by the growing numbers, which meant that members of the church could increasingly control local elections. What appears to happen sometimes is that Joseph Smith and other leaders of the church would indicate their preference for a particular candidate, and the whole church would follow that direction. These opponents attacked the saints, first verbally and then physically. Church leaders, including Joseph Smith, were tarred and feathered, beaten, and unjustly imprisoned. Other members of the church were also the victims of violent crimes. At least 17 men and boys, ranging in age from 9 to 78, were slaughtered in the Horns Mill massacre. We'll come on to that in just a moment. But first, let's look at Missouri Executive Order 44, known as the Mormon Extermination Order. This was a state executive order issued by Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs on October the 27th, 1838. Based on reports and rumors of Mormon military plans, Boggs claimed that the Mormons had committed open and avowed defiance of the law and had made war upon the people of Missouri. Governor Boggs directed that the Mormons must be treated as enemies and must be exterminated or driven from the state if necessary, for the public peace. Their outrages are beyond all description. Quote from Governor Boggs. The order was implemented by the state militia to forcefully displace the Mormons from Missouri. In response to the order, the Mormons surrendered and subsequently sought refuge in Nauvoo, Illinois. This comes from the Office of the Secretary of State of Missouri, 1841. This extermination order, and we should just mention that there was a dual definition of the word extermination. We tend to associate it only with killing and murder, or sometimes genocide, but as was implied earlier on, it could also mean that they were driven out of the territory. Extermination had that dual meaning. And that extermination order remained in force until 1976, when, citing its unconstitutional nature, the then Missouri governor, Kit Bond, formally rescinded it. Now, a couple of days or 3 days after the extermination order had been issued, a terrible tragedy took place. This was It's known as Horn's Mill Massacre. Jacob Horn was one of the first settlers along Shoal Creek in northwestern Missouri. He built a mill and he called the settlement Horn's Mill. It was about a day's walk from the large Latter-day Saint community in Far West. Horn was not a member of the church, but he was friendly with the group of Latter-day Saints who settled near his mill in the late 1830s. On October the 30th, so this is, as I say, 3 days later, after the extermination order had been given, October 30th, 1838, as part of the escalating violence that drove early Saints out of the state of Missouri, a company of rogue militiamen attacked the Saints at Horn's Mill. While women and most children from the settlement hid in the woods, a group of Latter-day Saint men and boys sought shelter in the blacksmith's shop. The attackers surrounded the shop and shot repeatedly through the gaps between the roughly hewn log walls, killing both those inside the shop and those who attempted to surrender. So the structure of the blacksmith's hut or house was that they had fairly large gaps in the logs or between the logs, and the militiamen could just literally poke their muskets through the gaps and take aim and shoot, and they did that with devastating outcomes. Now, historians pretty much think that although the extermination order had been issued 3 days previously, the militiamen who carried out this massacre would not have been aware of it and would not have been responding to it specifically. Amanda Barnes Smith wrote an autobiography later in 1858. She and her 5 children and her husband were there at Horn's Mill, and this is taken from the history topics on the church's website for Amanda Barnes. On October the 30th, Amanda, her daughters Elvira and Hortensia, and her son Willard survived the attack unscathed, but her husband Warren and her son Sardius were both killed. Her younger son Alma's hip was shot away. Desperate for help, Amanda prayed and received inspiration on how to create and apply a poultice to the wound. The joint was miraculously healed and Alma made a full recovery. So this is quite a well-trodden story in the church, and it's a very heart-rending story because of the suffering and the loss that Amanda Barnes Smith suffered and went through. Moving a little bit further forward down the timeline, this is taken from Parley P. Pratt's testimony at a Hancock County, Illinois court hearing, and the hearing was about an extradition request from Missouri for Joseph Smith to be returned to Missouri for charges of treason. And this is a document transcript recounting what Parley P. Pratt heard from the Missourians, describing what they did to the Latter-day Saints. And he says, quote, "They related the circumstances in detail of having the previous day disarmed a certain man in his own house and took him prisoner and afterwards beat out his brains with his own gun in presence of their officers. They told of other individuals laying here and there in the brush, whom they had shot down without resistance and who were laying unburied for the hogs to feed upon. They also named 1 or 2 individual females of our society, whom they had forcibly bound, and 20 or 30 of them, one after another, committed rape upon. One of these females was a daughter of a respectable family with whom I had been long acquainted and with whom I have since conversed and learnt that it was truly the case. Delicacy at present forbids my mentioning the names." Close quote. We'll come back to Parley P. Pratt a little bit later. He does feature right on the periphery of the Mountain Meadows massacre. Let's look at the Danites, and this is going back to Missouri in 1838. Mormon vigilantes, including many Danites, raided 2 towns believed to be centers of anti-Mormon activity, burning homes and stealing goods. Though the existence of the Danites was short-lived, it resulted in a long-standing and much embellished myth about a secret society of Mormon vigilantes. That quote is taken from the Gospel Topics essay, Peace and Violence Among 19th Century Latter-day Saints. Also taken from there is this quote: "Historians generally concur that Joseph Smith approved of the Danites, but that he probably was not briefed on all their plans and likely did not sanction the full range of their activities. Danites intimidated church dissenters and other Missourians. For instance, they warned some dissenters to leave Caldwell County." This kind of then brings us a bit later. Now, this is 1844. This is the murder of Joseph and Hiram Smith. Joseph and his brother Hiram were murdered by a mob in an Illinois prison. This is in Carthage jail. Despite the promise of the state's governor that the brothers would be protected while in custody. There are many, many different accounts of this murder, and there is one by an eyewitness who claims that, and he's not a member of the church, incidentally, he claims that he was leaving his house and wanting to go on a trip, but decided against it when the roads were full of people very excited about the fact that Joseph and Hiram Smith were incarcerated at Carthage jail, and the word on the street was that they were going to be murdered, and a lot of people were gathering to Carthage. And so this gentleman, whose name is William Daniels, he postponed his trip, altered his plans, went to Carthage and observed what happened, and then wrote about it. And he is his tale is sometimes quoted, but there are a lot of accounts of the murder of Joseph and Hiram Smith. Beginning in the cold winter month of February 1846, so now we've jumped a couple of years forward from the murder of Joseph and Hiram, and the saints recovering from that and recognizing that remaining in Nauvoo, Illinois, was simply not a possibility for them because of the opposition that had arisen because of the threats that they were receiving from the local population, demanding that they remove themselves from Nauvoo. And so they did. And so beginning in the cold winter month of February 1846, the main body of the saints left Nauvoo under tremendous pressure. They settled in temporary camps, what would now be called refugee camps, involving at least 8,000 Latter-day Saints on the plains of Iowa and Nebraska. An estimated 1 in 12 saints died in these camps during the first year. This information is taken from various sources, which you can see on the screen. My maths is not terribly good, but I calculated that 1 in 12 saints dying in these refugee camps, which were just on the other side of the river, the Mississippi. I calculated that as about 960 people, which is obviously a huge number of people dying. The conditions were poor. Malaria was fairly rife, and that was probably the cause of many of the deaths there. Now we're going to move further down the timeline. They've left those winter quarters that we were just looking at, and they are crossing the plains, or they have crossed the plains. And this is 1847 when they first arrive in the Salt Lake Valley, and and they start to settle, and they start to build, and they start to spread out. And of course, the indigenous population, the native Indians who had lived in that area for many, many centuries, and who had a completely different understanding of living on land, and obviously, and I guess understandably, there were tensions mounting. And so in late 1849, tensions between the Ute Indians and Mormons in Utah Valley escalated after a Mormon killed a Ute known as Old Bishop. Apparently, I read the reason he was called Old Bishop is because when he walked, it reminded the saints of one of the bishops in one of the branches or units that had been established there. So Old Bishop was killed by a member of the church who had accused him of stealing his shirt. This is also taken from the Gospel Topics essay. We should just pause and make the point, which the Gospel Topics essay makes, very strongly, that the relationships that the Latter-day Saints had with the Indians was, of course, complex and varied, and yes, at times it went into violence, and many lives were lost, some on both sides, but much, much more, or most, on the sides of the Indians. On the other hand, the church's attitude towards the Indians was significantly different to the attitudes of other settlers because of the church's belief in and its claims surrounding the Book of Mormon how that had come forward to the remnants of the children of Israel, who were, quote, the Lamanites. So the church's attitude was one of trying to help them, trying to reach out, trying to convert them, obviously, and trying to bring them the gospel into their lives, which would be a very markedly different approach to perhaps those of other settlers who were not members of the church. Settlers at Fort Utah reported other difficulties with the Indians, including the firing of weapons at settlers and the theft of livestock and crops. So just this reference to the theft of livestock and crops. And this is where one of the distinctions and differences comes in, because the settlers are clearly claiming the land, they're going to live on it, they're going to stay on it. They're not just passing through, and they want to own the land. Now, that would have been anathema to the Indians. They didn't believe in owning land. Their philosophy was that this land was there for their use, and they considered themselves sort of stewards of it, and anything on it was there for their use. And so if crops were growing, and if horses and cattle and sheep and others were present, that was for their use as far as their thinking went, which was obviously very different thinking to the settlers as they were colonizing the area. So Brigham Young counseled patience, telling them to stockade your fort, to attend to your own affairs, and let the Indians take care of theirs, close quote. That was from a letter that Brigham Young wrote to Isaac Higbee, October the 18th, 1849. Nevertheless, tensions mounted at Fort Utah, in part because local Mormons refused to turn over those involved in the murder of Old Bishop to the Utes or to pay reparations for his death. In the winter of 1849-1850, a measles epidemic spread from the Mormon settlers to the Ute camps, killing many Indians and heightening tensions. At a council of church leaders in Salt Lake City on January 31st, 1850, the leader of Fort Utah reported that the Utes' actions and intentions were growing increasingly aggressive. They say they mean to hunt our cattle and go and get the other Indians to kill us, close quote. In response, Governor Young authorized a campaign against the Utes. A series of battles in February 1850 resulted in the deaths of dozens of Utes and one Mormon. In these instances and others, some Latter-day Saints committed excessive violence against native peoples. Close quote. That's also taken from the Gospel Topics essays. Other sources indicate that the number of Indians who died was between 24 and 40, though a much later reminiscence places the death count among the Utes at around 100. Brigham Young, convinced of the need for action and persuaded by the unanimous recommendation of all those present, ordered a selective extermination campaign, is that word again, extermination campaign to be carried out against the Utah Valley Indians. He ordered that all the men were to be killed, women and children to be saved if they, quote, behave themselves. And military orders were immediately drafted to that effect by General Wells. This is Daniel Wells. Wells's Special Order Number 2, dated January 31st, 1850, and addressed to Captain George D. Grant, commander of the militia company, sent from Great Salt Lake City, reads in part, quote, "You are hereby ordered to cooperate with the inhabitants of said Utah Valley in quelling and staying the operations of all hostile Indians and otherwise act as the circumstances may require exterminating such as do not separate themselves from their hostile clans and sue for peace. So this is taken from the Utah Historical Quality volume and is available to look at on the University of Utah's site. An account of the dialogue of January 31st meeting can be found on a BYC site. Brigham Young is quoted as stating, quote, "I say go and kill them." So kill them is very specific and is using a particular definition of the word extermination. Tell Dimmock Huntington to go and kill them. Also Barney Ward. Let the women and children live if they behave themselves. We have no peace until the men are killed off. Never treat the Indians as your equal. And that can be found on the Utah State Archives. So this is a little bit of context here. No Latter-day Saint involvement was in this particular massacre. We did see that there were at least 150 skirmishes and battles between the Latter-day Saints and the Indians. But this is one that took place without any Latter-day Saint involvement. The Sand Creek Massacre, 1864, took place on the 29th of November. And by 1864, tensions between the settlers and the Native Americans of the plains were running high. Some of the Native American chiefs had made friendly treaties with the authorities. However, others were still engaged in hostile skirmishes with the army and settlers. On the 29th, Colonel John Chivington, leading 600 men of the Colorado militia, attacked the Sand Creek camp, scattering and hunting down men, women, and children. None of Chivington's men were killed, but 148 of the Native Americans were slaughtered. Many were women and children who were killed, and their bodies mutilated. In the press at the time, the massacre was often portrayed as a victory against the Cheyenne, but eyewitnesses discredited Chivington and his men when it became clear that they had perpetrated a massacre. And a little bit more on context here. This is something referred to as the doctrine of discovery. It's a policy that was enacted initially by the 15th century Catholic Church, proclaiming the right of Christian nations to take possession of the lands of non-Christians in the interest of saving their souls. Non-Christians were not recognized as legitimate landowners, and any lands discovered, quote, by Christian explorers were claimed as the property of the discoverer's nation. The 1493 Catholic papal bull made clear the duty of Christian explorers to seize the lands of non-Christians for the purpose of Christianizing the inhabitants and bringing them within the folds of European Christian civilization. Now, the reason I have included this was because I was interested to understand to what extent, if any, this doctrine of discovery might have impinged upon the thinking of Brigham Young and other church leaders at that time, and might have affected their attitude towards the indigenous population, the native Indians. I could not find in any of the documentation any reference to this doctrine of discovery. I could not find anywhere where Brigham Young made any reference to it. I also enlisted the help of the Church History Library, and the staff there were very kind, and they went through all of the documentation, and they too could not find any explicit reference to this doctrine. So it's it's a bit of a dead end and a red herring, and we don't have any evidence, or there is no evidence, that the doctrine of discovery had any impact on the thinking of the early church leaders as they settled in the Great Salt Lake Valley. However, moving on to another quote here from Heber C. Kimball, I was interested to see that whilst it's not explicit, I wondered to what extent it might be implicit. And so here, rather than contracting with the Indians for purchase of land or paying for the use of the land, policy proposed by Brigham Young in 1846 in Iowa, Heber C. Kimball declared that the Indians did not own the land in the first place. He discouraged the idea of paying the Indians for the lands, for if the Shoshones should be thus considered, the Utes and other tribes would claim pay also. He said, quote, "The land belongs to our Father in heaven, and we calculate to plough and plant it. And no man shall have the power to sell his inheritance, for he cannot remove it. It belongs to the Lord," close quote. This is taken from the Journal History of the Church, August 1st, 1847. So there's no reference here to the doctrine of discovery, but there is a kind of somewhat similar thought being expressed here by obviously a very senior church leader. And it's worth sort of feeding that into our contextual consideration as we look at and think about violence in the early history of the church in that respect, and particularly amongst the Indians. So there's kind of, I think there are two sides to this story. Yes, the church leaders at that time had a much more progressive, much more charitable feeling towards the Indians and their relationship with them, wanting definitely to bring the gospel to them, to Christianize them in that papal bull sense. But on the other hand, also, there appears to be this idea that this land belonged to God and not to the Indians. And so therefore there might have crept in this kind of justification for wanting to remove the Indians from their homelands. Utah's Black Hawk War is the name of the estimated 150 battles, and I mentioned this a moment ago, 150 battles, skirmishes, raids, and killings between Mormon settlers in southern Utah and members of the Ute, Paiute, and Navajo tribes. The Indians were led by a local Ute chief, Antonga Black Hawk. The conflict resulted in the abandonment of some settlements and postponed Mormon expansion in the region. The years 1865 to 1867 were by far the most intense of the conflict. The conflict went from 65 to 72. They built scores of forts and deserted dozens of settlements, while hundreds of Mormon militiamen chased their adversaries through the wilderness with little success. Requests for a federal troop went unheeded for 8 years. Unable to distinguish guilty from friendly tribesmen, frustrated Mormons at times indiscriminately killed Indians, including women and children. Close quote. That's taken from the Washington County, Utah Historical Society records. The picture there is of Black Hawk. The worst incident of the Black Hawk War, however, occurred in 1866 at the Mormon Meeting House in the small Piute County town of Circleville, where white settlers annihilated a band of captive Piute Indians, including helpless women and children. Undetected by the soldiers, so the reference to soldiers here, just to be kind of clear, is that there are lots of different types of soldiers. There are the soldiers who are paid by the Washington, USA government, and then there are soldiers who are enlisted county by county, region by region, into various militia. And one of the things that happened, let's see, when did that happen? I think it happened in 1857, so about 9 years before this. The Nauvoo Legion had been reconstituted in Utah. And so, and it was a Mormon militia. So when we talk about Mormon militia, what we're saying is that these are members of the church, men from the church who are in the militia, which is still known as the Nauvoo Legion. And that's what we're talking about. So undetected by the soldiers, the Pied men had managed to unloose the ropes that bound them. They waited until the evening when the guards changed and then sprang on their captors. In the struggle that followed, all of the Piedi Indians were shot and killed. Panicked by the bloody incident, the soldiers felt it necessary, as one resident put it, to, quote, dispose of the squaws and papooses, close quote, to prevent them from telling of the massacre and inciting further violence. The women and children were brought from the cellar one at a time and killed. A.C. Anderson recalled seeing the throat slit of the first Indian brought up. In all, at least 16 Piedis were massacred that day. 3 or 4 small children too young to talk were spared and adopted by local families, close quote. The figure of 16 is from one source. Other sources, such as Philip Godfredson, who has done a huge amount of research in this particular area, spending many years amongst the descendants and the ancestors of those who were massacred. He claims the figure is 27, Paiute, Kusharam, men, women, and children. This brings us then to the final thing that I want to talk about today. So what we've done is we've talked about violence that was perpetrated against the church and against the members of the church, particularly in Missouri, also in Kirtland, and also in Illinois, in Nauvoo. But we've also then moved on and we've talked about some of the violence that has been perpetrated by members of the church. And so far, that has been pretty much mostly upon the indigenous population, the Indians. Now we're going to talk about Mountain Meadows Massacre. And again, another health warning. This is a very unsettling and very shameful and awful moment in church history, but this is not Latter-day Saints against the indigenous Indians. This is what a lot of historians refer to as a white-on-white massacre. So let's read what the number 17 information stone says, which was erected in 1932. Mountain Meadows, a favorite recruiting place on the old Spanish Trail. In this vicinity, September the 7th to the 11th, the sort of 5-day experience, in 1857, occurred one of the most lamentable tragedies in the annals of the West. A company of about 140 Arkansas and Missouri emigrants, led by Captain Charles Fancher, en route to California, was attacked by white men and Indians. We'll come back to that in a moment. All but 17, being small children, were killed. John D. Lee, who confessed participation as leader, was legally executed here, March 23rd, 1877. So this plaque is actually at the site of the Mountain Meadows massacre. Most of the emigrants were buried in their own defense pits. This monument was reverently dedicated September 10th, 1932 by the Utah Pioneer Trails and Landmarks Association and the people of southern Utah. So again, let's look at some of the context that was going on around the time that led to the events that culminated in this dreadful massacre. And of course, when we look at context, we're not trying to make any excuses here. We're just trying to understand as best one can, looking back after all these years, at the historical situation and the context. So there were a number of things that could be mentioned. Febrile times. What do we mean by febrile times? Well, we mentioned that in 1857, the church under Brigham Young's leadership had reorganized the Nauvoo Legion as the Mormon militia. And this was a large group of men, more than 500 men who were armed and who were responsible for keeping peace, settling disputes, etc. Remember, this is the Utah Territory. This is not part of the United States. I mean, it is part of the United States, but it's not a state in itself. And other things that contributed to the febrile times. These are my words here, by the way, although they're in quotes. So one thing to bear in mind is that President James Buchanan, who was President of the United States in 1857, he dispatched what is thought to be about a quarter of the whole of the American army. This is the paid soldiers. And he dispatched them down to Utah to quell what was regarded or had been reported to him as a Mormon rebellion, in that the report contained information that some court records had been destroyed by the territorial governor, that would have been Brigham Young, and or people that were reported to him, and that 3 territorial officers that had been sent previously into Salt Lake by the U.S. administration, they had reported that they felt their lives were in danger. And so President Buchanan, hearing this, he dispatches this large army under the command of Colonel Johnson, and it is on its way down to Utah. So that's part of the sort of febrile times, is this, and the members of the church are aware of this. They know it's coming. And so they're all in a heightened state of war, and they are preparing for war. They think there is going to be a big battle between themselves and the United States government. remember their legacy experience of involvement with and from the United States government or state-run government has not been very positive, and so they're thinking very negatively, and that contributes to the febrile times. Another thing that contributes to these times is that in the year before, 1856, September, Brigham Young announces what's known as the Reformation, which is a plan to arouse religious consciousness amongst the members of the church. And this also had the effect of encouraging, possibly encouraging a rather fanatical suspicion of outsiders. Some of the language that Brigham Young, Heber C. Kimball, and others had used was that some conduct on behalf of non-Mormons was so horrendous and bad, and the sins that they were committing were so bad that their blood would have to be shed in order for them to receive divine forgiveness at some point in the future. So we've got these febrile times. We've got rampant rumor of things going on with the army coming down. We've also got another rumor that comes to the ears of the saints, and this is very specific to this particular wagon train that's coming up from Arkansas, the Charles Fancher and the Fancher-Baker wagon train. These were the two chief leaders, Baker and Fancher, of this particular wagon train. But there were many, many families in this wagon train, 140 people in total. And again, historians think that this wagon train was coming up, and sometimes people would join it and then they would leave it, and other people would join it and leave it. And so it was a bit of a fluctuating time. And there is a rumor that that some of the people on this wagon train had been involved in the murder of Joseph and Hiram Smith in Carthage. Historians who've looked at this very, very closely do not find any evidence to support that rumor, but the rumor is there at the time. And another rumor at the time is that somebody claimed that one of the people on this wagon train had bragged that they had a gun that had been used, or a musket that had been used to shoot Joseph Smith. So there's this kind of wrongdoing, legacy wrongdoing. This is how they feel about any attempt to control the church by the government or by the state or by whatever. War is in the air, injudicious sermonizing, massive othering. So the feeling that is developed amongst the Latter-day Saints is that anybody who's not a Latter-day Saint could very well be someone we needed to fear, and we needed to kind of demonize, subconsciously demonize, and to think that they are going to attack us. So this fear, this false evidence appearing real, is part of that. And coupled with all of those things, we then have the three key church leaders, two of them who were stake presidents. One is the president of the branch closest to the Mountain Meadows area. And these three individuals appear to engage in lying and providing false information at that time. So that's a little bit of the background to the Mountain Meadows massacre. They start attacking the wagon train, and the other sort of legacy rumor about the Mountain Meadows massacre, the actual massacre itself, is that it was carried out by the Indians, by the Paiutes themselves. And this is part of the lying, because these three individuals that are named there, John D. Lee, Isaac C. Haight, and William Dame, they all go with the story that this was the Indians. The reality is that this was not perpetrated by the Indians, although some of the Indians were there and they may have assisted. But if they were doing so, it was purely because they had been promised that if they did, they would receive supplies and other rewards. They did not initiate this attack, the Indians, but they were blamed for it for many, many years, for decades, probably over a century. They were blamed for it. And it wasn't until much later in the 50s and 60s that the full story began to come out. So the assessments of this, there are lots and lots of books written about the Mountain Meadows massacre. The one on the extreme left here, Mormonism Unveiled, is actually written or co-written, partly written by John D. Lee himself. He was he was referred to as a kind of an Indian farmer. By that, it meant that he was training and teaching Indians how to farm, and he had reasonably close relationship with the Indians, and they had a trust with him. And he had been involved in the initial skirmishes with this wagon train, and was involved in firing the initial shots. And 2 or 3, or I think it may have been 5, initially were killed in the wagon train on the 7th of September. And part of the story that John Lee and Isaac Haight and William Dame concocted is that some members of the wagon train had seen that the killers were in fact white men and not Indians. And so they then feared, that is Lee, Haight and Dame then feared that information was going to get out and get back everywhere. And this Fancher Baker wagon train was on its way to California, and they did not want that information to reach there. So their rationale for carrying out the massacre was that because we had already killed some, we now have to kill all of them. And Isaac Haight and William Dame, they both convened what we would refer to these days as state councils. They were councils. I don't know whether they were called state councils in those days. And at these councils, it was discussed what we should do. And the council had suggested that we need to get a rider going up to Salt Lake with a letter to Brigham Young and to find out what President Young would want us to do. And the council was warning against taking any military action against this wagon train. Let them go in peace was basically what the council was suggesting. And the problem arose after the council had dispatched, and they dispatched the rider, and the council had finished. But two or three of the main protagonists met afterwards, and William Dame, who was the senior military leader of the Mormon militia, he took the decision that they should annihilate the whole of the wagon train. And William Dame was a stake president, and Isaac Haight was also a stake president at that time as well. So this book, Mormonism Unveiled, was written in 1877. The historians are not totally sure who actually wrote it, whether John D. Lee wrote some of it. It's thought that his lawyer, William Bishop, wrote most of it. And so that is a kind of a slanted side of what happened. Josiah Francis Gibbs is coming up in 1910 with more information about the Mountain Meadows Massacre. Juanita Brooks in 1950 is really the first one who makes it very clear that this was all perpetrated by members of the church with a little bit of help from the Indians, but she refocuses the blame away from the Indians and onto the church. She doesn't believe that Brigham Young ordered, as a lot of people have said that or alleged, that Brigham Young ordered the massacre. That is not her conclusion, although she does criticize Brigham Young very much for what she describes as the injudicious sermonizing that created this sort of febrile environment. Will Bagley's 2002 book, Blood of the Prophets, kind of reaches rather similar conclusions to Juanita Brooks's book. And what's considered, certainly by the church and by many church historians, is the definitive book on the subject by Ronald Walker, Richard Turley, and Glenn Leonard, is Massacre at Mountains Meadows, which came out in 2008. And the reason that is considered to be one of the more sort of reliable is simply because of the depth of research that they did. They spent about 20 years or so looking at every document that they could, literally lay their hands on. And they then followed up, or Richard Turley followed that up in 2023, more recently, with Barbara Jones Brown, Vengeance is Mine, which goes over some of the details and then also looks a great deal more closely at the aftermath and the two trials of John D. Lee, his subsequent execution, the involvement, the legal efforts to bring others to justice, why they were not successful, etc. There's a lot more detail in that one. And then Convicting the Mormons, the Mountain Meadows Massacre, May 2023, Janice Johnson. And again, she's looking much more looking at the aftermath of it and how the church as a whole was sort of convicted is not quite the right word probably, but accused of its involvement and how it was blamed in the public press for its culture and so forth. So there are lots and lots of other books that cover this subject and films that have been made that cover the subject that are available. But those are some of the ones that are more prominent, I would suggest. So a little bit of a postscript here, and then we need to wrap up. This quotation comes from the letter that Brigham Young wrote to Isaac C. Haight on September the 10th. So remember, the massacre kind of got started on the 7th, but it culminated on the 11th of September. But Brigham Young is 300 miles away in Salt Lake City. It's at least a 2-day ride on a good horse. But so it all arrives. His letter arrives a day or two later after the events have taken place. But this is a quote from his letter. In regard to emigration trains passing through our settlements, we must not interfere with them until they are first notified to keep away. You must not meddle with them. The Indians, we expect, will do as they please, but you should try and preserve good feelings with them. There are no other trains going south that I know of. If those who are there will leave, let them go in peace, while we should be on the alert, on hand, and always ready. We should also possess ourselves in patience, preserving ourselves in property, ever remembering that God rules. Close quotes. Photograph of Brigham Young on the left. A picture, I guess it's a photograph of Isaac C. Haight. He was the Cedar City mayor, militia major, and state president. And he later lamented, quote, "I would give a world, if I had it, if we had abided by the decision of the council," close quote. And when he received this letter from Brigham Young, Isaac Haight read it and apparently burst into tears and said, "Too late, too late." So just going back to Richard Turley, who, as I mentioned earlier, is the author of numerous books, and one particularly on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and then more recently the one Vengeance is Mine that he did with Barbara Jones. I just wanted to share his conclusion because I think he's a bit of a sage. He's looked into this for much of his working life, 40 years. He's looked into all of this history and other aspects of history, and he probably knows more about the Mountain Meadows Massacre than anybody else alive. And he says this, quote, "No one alive today is responsible for the Mountain Meadows Massacre, but we are all responsible for how we deal with it, including learning from the lessons it teaches. Let us never deny or condone the massacre or try to excuse those who took part. Rather, let us resolve to 1. Avoid fanaticism, 2. Not overreact to rumours, 3. Not give in to peer pressure, 4. Find safety in councils, 5. Not try to cover up wrongdoing, 6. Deal with hard topics honestly, and 7. Love anyone we might be tempted to view as an enemy." The number 6 there, dealing with hard topics honestly, is I think a veiled reference to Juanita Brooks's experience. She was a real pioneer historian in the sense that she was the one in 1950 who brought the consciousness of the Latter-day Saints much more closely aligned with what actually happened at Mountain Meadows Massacre. However, her contribution was not very well received, and she did suffer a lot of pushback at that time. This is in 1950. So I think his reference there to deal with hard topics honestly is a bit of a chastisement aimed at the church, because the church has in the past not always dealt with hard topics honestly, and definitely needs to do that. I hope this hasn't been too horrendous for you or too triggering for you. It is a very difficult subject, but I think it's a vitally important subject and one that needs to be addressed. We need to understand it, and as Richard Turley says, we need to learn lessons that it teaches us. This and all aspects of church history teaches us. Thank you very much for your time today. Get you on the next one. Thank you. Bye-bye.